So just to get into today's session, as I mentioned, it will be on data governance, security and risk with myself, Jack, we've got Yulia and Joe. So just to start with some introductions, I'll be very briefly introducing and hosting today. I'm Jack, I'm one of the EMEA customer success managers. A few of you attending may have heard of me, worked with me here or there. Yeah, I'll just be hosting, introducing the topic, and I'll jump back in later on in the session for a Q&A. But I'll let our other hosts who are on the line, Yulia and Joe, introduce themselves as well. Yulia, if you'd like to maybe introduce yourself briefly.
Sure, thank you, Jack. Hi all, my name is Yulia. I'm based in Ukraine and I've been with Orbus for a bit more than a year now, providing professional services for various customers across the globe, but primarily working with EMEA customers, so consulting and advising them to ensure successful implementation of Orbus and sharing both product expertise and industry best practices. And before Orbus, I've spent another 5 years working for a global technology leader in a data management services team specifically. So we'll be happy to share a bit more about data piece as well as overall an introduction like to approach to data governance.
And hello everyone, my name is Joe Ferber. I'm also a professional services consultant here with Orbus. Been with Orbus for as well a little bit over a year. I come from a background of healthcare, working for a very large healthcare software company, so very experienced with regulatory risks and compliance standards. So very excited to speak with you all about them today.
Perfect. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Yulia. So just to go over the agenda, we're going to start with a short introduction to the topic today, just some of the key areas of what really the topic is, why it's important. Once we've covered that, we'll get into a presentation and demo with Yulia, focusing on initially data governance, and then we'll have a subsequent section on security and risk with Joe, and then we should have a good 10-15 minutes at the end of the session for a Q&A. As I said, please do ask any questions that you've got throughout the session, just so we've got plenty to come back to at the end, and we'll make sure that we can get as many of those as we can answered. So just to get into an introduction, really starting with data architecture and the first topic of today. What is data architecture? Who is it for? Why is it important? Well, data architecture is a set of rules, policies, standards, and models that govern and define the type of data collected, how it's used, stored, managed, integrated across the organization and its systems. It's about understanding where your data is, what the flow of that data is across the company, and really being able to kind of control where your data is and how it operates and who has access to it across systems, applications, and users across the business. So as part of that, today we'll be looking at, as I say, how to kind of see your data portfolio within OrbusInfinity and break that down through visualizations and reporting to really get a strong picture of where it is, control it, and allow not only to make sure that you manage the compliance aspects, but then learn how you can then improve and make your business more efficient and where there are gaps that you can fill, as well as just seeing that current picture. So kind of moving on a little bit more, that will be the first topic really, is to start with data governance, which Yulia will break down for you in a second. Then we'll get more into risk management, little overview on risk management and what that is here, but really it's having that clear picture across the business of what risks you have across the business and what those risks are related to. For example, related to certain applications, technologies, even locations across the business, and how to mitigate those risks, prioritize those, and really have that clear picture of where the danger is and what can be done to improve and mitigate those risks. And then hand in hand with risk is more of the security side of things as well, which again Joe will be expanding on alongside that. So some of the common goals with the risk and security side of things, centrally managed and governed risk landscape, being able to have that clear picture of where your risks are across the business, managing cybersecurity risks that are associated with, for example, technical debt, cloud applications, seeing, okay, across my application portfolio, where are any kind of standout risks? How can I mitigate those? Off the back of that, being able to assess risks associated with certain areas and identify the impact of obsolescence and capability risks. So there are some of the high-level topics. I don't want to spend too long really introducing those because we're going to get into more of the detail now. So I'll hand over to Julia, who's going to run through in a bit more detail the data governance side of things, and then we'll hand over to Joe. So thanks, over to you, Julia, and yeah, any questions, anyone, please do pop those in the chat.
Cool, thank you, Jack. So let's talk a bit about data. So we all know that in today's digital age, data is the biggest asset. It is fueling the informed decision making and provides rich business analytics, if, of course, it is managed right and is governed. And as recently read an article where the VP and principal analyst at Forrester Research, Noel Johanna, says that every organization on the planet has more than 24 data management tools, and none of these tools talk to each other. So too often there is a little understanding of that data either, along with how it is captured, who has access to it, where it is processed, by who, through which systems, what is the quality of this data, and so on. And where there is a little understanding and knowledge of your enterprise data and low data quality, not only you are compromising the analytics and informed decision making, but you are missing opportunities. You're losing trust among businesses to use such data, or you are even exposing your organization to potential threats. So therefore, data governance is crucial to really treat your data as an asset. Or I even like one statement by CIO that who's led digital transformations, Isaac Sokolic, that it's not just data governance, but a proactive data governance. So you're not just complying with regulations, privacy or security, and you're not just fixing some data DATs and data quality issues, but you are democratizing data with the data catalogs and establishing some master data sources. In the next few slides, we'd like to just briefly walk you through the approach to data governance and to data specifically, and how OrbusInfinity can support you in that journey. And the approach to data governance to us starts really with discovering the data within your organization and how it is managed, to understand really all of the different data assets that you have across your repositories, which may be in cloud, on-prem, or even some like SaaS applications. Then once it is discovered, and the process overall is not only about like gathering the data that you know, but really discovering the data that you might not necessarily know about, because quite often this is the data that could provide those new opportunities or pose the risks. Once the data is discovered, it must be classified. And the process of classification can be also called like a categorization, because it's essentially assigning data to different categories. So whether it is customer data, product data, financial data, and then providing basically that level to it. And then once this data is classified and labeled, some policies can get into a play to decide then how those different categories of the data must be managed. So policies could be of different nature, and they can come from different sources. So it can be some internal data protection policy or a policy that is applicable to a certain industry or a national guideline, such as a GDPR. And while policies are about setting the guidelines and standards about what to do with your data, establishing rules within the organization then helps to comply with those policies. So for example, there are quite common policies around customer data, and in particular personal identifiable information, such as a bank account number. So the rule will state that this information must be masked, and that basically helps you to enforce your policy. And then what helps to effectively manage and use going forward your data is leveraging metadata. And metadata, or as we call them, attributes, they help to describe what that data asset is, collecting various information that surrounds your enterprise data. And it provides you basically a summary of what's inside of the data source without having to actually dive into it every time that you've got to use this. So you can treat this like a package of something, and you don't need to unpack and analyze the components of it, but just read through a note on top that provides a key brief that one working with this data set needs to know. And so with those 5 steps, discovering the data, classifying it, defining policies, reinforcing those policies with rules, and capturing the relevant metadata. So this is the approach to proactively govern your enterprise data. And what is then important is to have a solution that would allow to capture all of this information in a connected and integrated way, thus breaking the data silos that exist in too many organizations today, being able to manage the access to this data, inviting the business team to embrace the citizen data science and use that data for decision making, and be able to generate the analytics, which could be then consumed either internally or shared with the stakeholders in a user-friendly format. And this is right there at the first phase. Once your enterprise data is discovered, it's important then to catalog it and make it available at a central repository, which would pull all of the related architecture bits together, thus centralizing your data and establishing the appropriate permissions model to enable the further enrichment of this data and making sure that it's up to date. So this is where OrbusInfinity gets into the picture. So providing that central repository where your data catalogs from various places can be imported, maintained, and enriched with valuable metadata, and mapping to other architectural concepts for impact analysis, as well as making overall available to the right people and at the right format. And for the import part, there are various methods to bring your data catalogs into OrbusInfinity. One very much common, the one that I'm going to very briefly demonstrate to you as well in a quick demo, is via Excel spreadsheets, leveraging the add-in that we have for Microsoft Excel, allowing you to just import the entire spreadsheet and the data that you have within it to your OrbusInfinity repository. And we have as well some pre-configured importation templates to import the entire data catalog with some of the key metadata, so what we find relevant for this specific use case. Then another, of course, option is to connect some other system via the open API that OrbusInfinity provides, so that you do connect some other sources where your data currently resides to your central repository. And then we have as well functionality just to import the content. So if you have some content residing in the visual diagrams, of course, we can also import those, thus committing the contents of the diagram into your main repository. But then while we are importing the data, while we are bringing the data into a repository, quite logical question that may arise is, but what the data and the metadata is valuable to be brought into the EA repository? And this is a quite important question, because we, of course, need to bring only that data which can support your decision making and drive insights. And while there is surely no one-size-fits-all solution, and there might be different needs and requirements in different organizations, still we at Orbus have developed some core meta model that supports most organizations in developing their data architecture, as well as looking at some main industry standards such as TOGAF and Archimate, and overall working with over 600 organizations globally as of today. So let's have a look at how this meta model looks like in more detail, then we'll move for a quick demo. And so then, yeah, the problem of identifying relevant data. And the meta model for data architecture looks as follows. I'll be doing quite several clicks, hope no lag on your side there. So at the core, we have data entities, with the data entity being a self-contained piece of information that has a clear meaning to the business, such as a customer account or a purchase order. And it is at a data entity level where we keep that relevant, hopefully, metadata. And the common valuable metadata, or as we call them, attributes, as I mentioned. So these are as follows, as you can see on the screen on the right-hand side. So there is a description, the ID, business order, the processing of commercially sensitive information, data criticality, data steward, definition, information security classification, processing of PII, or personally identifiable information, and data storage. So these are like the subset of some of the key metadata which we believe helps to analyze your portfolio. Of course, it can be extended, but that is just something that we have found as the most common metadata information. And then, of course, besides the data entity itself, there are some other important concepts that we map data entities to. So by establishing relationships in the repository. So this is for sure the data category. So data category is a separate concept or object type in the meta model, which provides that classification that we mentioned previously. So to classify your data in terms of like to categorize your data. So whether it is a product, customer, finance, and so on. So this data category then constitutes basically data reference model taxonomy as a hierarchical structure. And then you might go as well a little bit further to see what applications or processes are processing the data entities, or they are like creating, updating, deleting your data entities. So we do include those two concepts into that key meta model as well, like the core meta model, and recommend to establish this information in your repository to be able to actually trace the impact, so how your information flows across the organization. And then location is another common concept that overall is mapped to many architectural concepts as well, and the data is no exception. And location in this specific use case could actually represent your data centers. So having this information is overall a very good foundation to be able to analyze your data portfolio, but there are in fact more concepts that are still very much applicable, such as projects, controls, risks, and requirements. So with the letter 3 being crucial in security and risk initiatives, not only for data, but in other use cases as well. And this is something that Joe will cover as well in a moment. But once you have brought this information to your repository, you can then use various capabilities of OrbusInfinity to enrich the data, share with the wider team for inputs, leveraging, for example, SharePoint that normally is known to your wider audience, so to your business teams and to your stakeholders, as well as generate visualizations and the Power BI reports to start finally getting insights out of all of that data gathering and classification and enrichment that you have been doing till now. So for that, let me actually switch to a very quick demo for a few minutes to see how the data reside in the OrbusInfinity once we have, for example, have it as a foundation within Excel spreadsheet. So how it looks then from repository itself, as well as how you can then leverage SharePoint and the visualization options such as the Power BI reports to then share those insights to the wider audience. So I'm gonna just switch to the browser for now. And in fact, before I go to OrbusInfinity, let's say that we want to analyze the data that first resides in something like this. So even before we just open the importation add-ins. So these are the add-ins that we have specifically for Microsoft Excel, allowing you to then import the contents of your Excel spreadsheet to the OrbusInfinity. So you have some list of data entities. We have some of those critical attributes or metadata, which we've previously mentioned on the slide. Maybe we don't have all of them at the moment. So you see that I have some of the columns left as blank, and this is still okay. So of course, it's a journey to get to the data completeness that is desired and that is set as a target for your organization. But whatever is the state for you, it's good then to centralize this information in the repository and then maybe enrich it through the different formats. So we may then use the add-ins, including, for example, selection workbook or entire workbook, navigate through the add-ins. Not going to do this in full at the moment, but we have lots of various resources as well on the importation. But this is the contents as is, as we want to import them into our main repository. And we also have some importation sheets, such as, for example, specifically for this data use case, allowing us to also reference the structure, how the file needs to be structured for both selection and for example, entire workbook method, so that we just don't do any mapping, but basically the structure is already supported to automatically create all of this data by 2 clicks really. But then once we have imported this data, so how it looks like from the repository. So if we want to have a look at one of the views, and I have some around data specifically, I've also favorited them here within the OrbusInfinity platform. So if I want to have a data catalog, in fact, I think I have it open here. We can see that these are the same information that resided in the Excel spreadsheet, but we can then visualize the information that we have already imported into the tool, add some filters on top of it. So if we want to only see data coming from a specific data category, or data that is only critical, or anything else, so we have rich functionalities to filter out the data and to apply conditional formatting. Not going to cover much on that. We'll have also Joe demonstrating some of the other type of the views, but this is then what you can have available as well on the SharePoint and present even as it is, and invite others to collaborate, for example, to fill in the gaps. Or you can also directly from OrbusInfinity keep enriching the data by bulk editing here. So if we select the several rows, we'll be able to edit information in bulk. Or if you want to do that mapping, so the classification step of the data governance journey, so to map data entities to data categories, you may as well play the matrix, which is another type of view within the OrbusInfinity. So here on the left-hand side, like as rows, we have the data categories, and then the checkboxes actually represent the established relationship between the two. So the mapping is completed, letting us know that this accounting data entity belongs to the accounts category. And establishing this is just a matter of selecting the cells and creating a new relationship. So this is overall, once the data is imported, of course, to the repository, we can then visualize even using some of the capabilities inside of the OrbusInfinity, keep enriching the data. But this is, of course, for the users that do have access to OrbusInfinity like application, and which are then expected to directly work with a bit more proactively with and actively with data enrichment. But then we also have, of course, SharePoint, which is a very powerful platform to present this information to the wider audience. And there we have also some additional type of the visualizations that we may use, including a Power BI report that I'd like also to demonstrate. So let me go to the SharePoint page, and this is how it may look like. That doesn't look too fancy though, so maybe design-wise, you'll do way better designs for your SharePoint pages. But a key thing is that we are creating a page for our initiative or for our use case. So here, let's say we want to have something around data. And this is, you see that the same view which we've looked at just a while ago from OrbusInfinity. This is how we can then have it available from SharePoint and invite others to collaborate by, for example, enriching some of the information directly from here. So if there are some teams that would prefer collaborating from SharePoint and not from the iServer repository, like from OrbusInfinity, this is what they can surely do. But then if I scroll a little bit below, so some of those additional web parts, Joe will also demonstrate, because here we're basically also seeing all of the impact that this data entity has on the rest of the like architectural concepts that we've kept in the repository. So this is the additional web part that we have for OrbusInfinity. But then if I scroll still to the bottom a little bit, we have a Power BI report, and this is something that we very much recommend to also explore. So this is, as I mentioned in the beginning, that of course we're all striving to like get some insights out of like data, and to see some of the insights in a user-friendly format that can be then shared with the stakeholders, or even for ourselves like internally. So what is our data portfolio? So what's the breakdown for the like those different metadata classifications, such as the personal identifiable information, where our data portfolio is distributed, so the location information. So all of this on a very high level and in a user-friendly format is presented via this data portfolio core pack, where we can then navigate through the tabs. And let me actually make this a little bit larger for you, so that the first tab presents the overall data catalog. So where we can see the catalog which we have brought in, let's say by that Excel import previously, which is then having as well mapping to the data categories. So if we only want to see the list of data entities, not all of the 111 that we've got in the repository, but only those that are coming from finance data category, then the list, of course, will reflect only those that are mapped to the data categories. Data mapping could have been done through that matrix that I was showing previously. And then here we are having all of those key metadata brought in, what once again we believe is quite important for this use case. So all of this information is that being pulled within this out of the like report by default, right? So this report is pre-configured and is going out of the box from Solutions Hub. So it's really just 2 clicks to activate it, to place the name of the model, the working area where this data actually resides, and then all of this visualizations are showing up with all of the filters. So if you want to filter out for a specific business owner or a data steward, or only see the data that is critical, so this is all what you can see in the first general data catalog view. Then if you want to deep dive into the data per location and have additional insights, for example, if you're interested in those data entities in Brussels data center, hopefully that I didn't refresh the report, and that's why I think it's showing up like that. Good thing to refresh the report before the demo, by just let me refresh within the browser. So the location one will give you then that breakdown into data entity catalog per location, and with additional deep dive into the who is the data steward for that data entity, as well as there you go. Let me just also enrich that. You see that's the demo ghost that just happens when you have to do the demo. There you go. So when you then filter out, you can then see besides the data steward also the storage of the actual data entities. So whether it's on premise, or country cloud, the overseas cloud, and so on. The data classification is that essential breakdown that I mentioned previously to then have a look, okay, out of my entire catalog, how much of the commercially sensitive information are we processing, or the PII information, or the breakdown of the information security classifications, so the data that is secret, confidential, public, and internal. And of course, all of this is clickable, right? So if we want to see only information that is, for example, secret, so we'll be able to then filter out this data to see only those data entities. And on the left-hand side here, we start to see some of those mappings that we've mentioned previously, that it's important to see applications and processes that are then processing that data, or that are creating or deleting the data entity. So this is a starting point where we get to see that, but the next 2 tabs are actually providing the deep dives into also something like a matrix. You can also generate similar insights from OrbusInfinity, but these ones are dynamically presenting to you the processes, and on the left-hand side we have a process structure. So we have a 3-level processes, and each level how many data entities they are the process is creating, reading, updating, or deleting. And on the right hand side we see that matrix itself, which we can scroll to the right to see more processes, or normally we are interested in some specific ones under a specific, for example, parent, or a specific one which we can search for or click here within the view itself, such as manage enterprise risk, let's say. And this will only then give us the following for processes and the data entities that they are deleting in this case, or creating. So there's the CROT abbreviation which is applied here. Same goes with the application. So this is, of course, then very much important to have then an understanding of the systems and processes that are then processing and working and having overall access to your data. Lastly, before I hand over to Joe for the second part of the presentation, the last tab which we have here in this Power BI report is also quite important one around data completeness. So this is why, as I mentioned, you shouldn't be targeting at the data completeness 100% from the day one. So therefore, you should be importing your data to start getting some of the insights which you have in the repository. While in this Power BI report, you will also be able to see, okay, but what are we missing here from that like baseline of relevant data that we have, for example, identified? What are those that you probably are missing today in terms of both attributes as well as in terms of the relationship completeness? Because here we also have like a map, like a table saying that, for example, who is the data steward of the data entity, whether there is an established relationship to the application, process, location, and data category, and then the attribute completeness is also provided here. Well, here we also see the first insight, which is super important, is that the business owner is really at a 0. While with the data steward, we are still more or less good. Business owner is missing, and this is very important insight, because in general, if we talk about data governance, we know that overall within the EA and data governance specifically as well, the establishing roles is very much important. And equally as in the data governance initiatives and in any change management initiatives as well, there is a critical role of, for example, sponsorship. So there should be also sponsors for your initiatives to then drive the transformation. Also, it is very much important to have a domain ownership, to then make sure that there is an owner for your data. And this is not in fact unique to the data use case, but in the data, it's even one of that key core principle in the trending concept of the data mesh. So the principle and the concept of domain ownership is really key to then make sure that there will be people who are keeping the data up to date, that are responsible for it, and that are able to monitor all of those insights as well as all of the risks that may be connected to your data. So more on risks and security, Joe will be able to continue. So I'll hand over to you, Joe.
Perfect. Thank you, Julia. I'm going to share my screen here. And it should be up there. Can we see my screen okay?
Yep, we can see it.
Perfect. All right, thank you for that wonderful handoff. Again, my name is Joe Ferber. I'm going to be walking through a couple of the items we have pertaining to security and risk within OrbusInfinity. So why do we care about risk? Obviously, within an organization, you're going to have several different risks, anything from data leaks or access issues or system downtimes. There are a whole host of different risks that can impact different organizations. Within OrbusInfinity, we have different tools that allow us to show the number of risks in your system, a catalog of those risks, and then impacts of those risks. So if my warehouse in Miami, Florida goes down for a week, what systems are going to be impacted at the end of the line? What technologies or what applications might suffer because of that downtime? And so it's important to have that list of risks available as well as the impact of those risks. And so within OrbusInfinity, we have the ability to keep that list up to date. So to update the details or attributes of those risk objects within the system to know what's the impact here, or how likely is this risk going to happen? And we'll see that in just a minute. It also helps us to identify different risks that we might not be aware of. So within connecting different objects within OrbusInfinity, we can see if this happens, what might occur at the end of the line. So understanding these relationships helps to make more informed business decisions as you're going forward with your organization. So within EA, you want to be speaking the same language here. So you want to represent your organization in the same sort of language, depending on whether it's security and risk or application portfolios or other aspects of your enterprise, you want to make sure that you're keeping this consistent across all of those different areas. And so, of course, within risk, we want to make sure that we're defining risk consistently. So one risk versus another, what determines a new risk object versus a duplicative risk object. How are we defining the attributes or the details about those risks? And we'll see in a minute here the different meta model components that we have that build in that risk. However, it's important to note that this doesn't hijack your overall risk functions. OrbusInfinity has a lot of different really great tools to help represent and make decisions on your risk catalog, but it doesn't replace policies or any internal documentation different organizations might have to denote how you should handle a certain risk. So speaking of meta model components, and Yulia touched on this just a bit here, we have different objects within the system that represent aspects of your enterprise. So whether that is, like in this example, a risk, or your applications, or even different capabilities of those applications or processes of those risks, they're all interconnected in what we call the meta model. So how we represent your organization. And so within our security and risk functionality, we are primarily concerned with obviously the risk objects, as well as the control, and then different objects, as you can see at the bottom here, that are related to the risk. So if I have a certain risk, it might impact applications down the line. Or if, like in my Miami warehouse example, I might have the location that is impacted by a risk, or even technologies that might be impacted by that downtime. So our best practice here with OrbusInfinity is to have this different information brought into your system. On the left-hand side, you can see those different objects listed out that I just mentioned, as well as the description of what each of these might be. So your risk catalog, it's pretty self-explanatory, but you might need a capability map if you don't have one in your organization already. So what are your high-level capabilities to help you manage and mitigate these risks? What different steps can you take for each of these risks? These might be represented with capabilities. You'll see a couple of bolded terms, of course, our risk registrar and our list of controls, as well as our data. So one of the aspects that we want to represent here, our data catalog. So if you have a data leak, what data is going to be leaked, or what data has the potential to be leaked, so that if it does occur, you can make decisions about what steps you want to take going forward. And within OrbusInfinity itself, we have the ability to control different access within the system. So on the top left side of my screen here, you can see my baseline architecture model. A model within OrbusInfinity is just a way to silo different data or projects together in my representation here. And we're able to control access to these different models depending on the profile of a user. So you can see I have added a security architect profile as sort of a moderator of this model. So they have larger permissions to be able to edit, update, delete a different system within the model that other users might not have. So it's important to have that different levels of security within your system to help mitigate any potential risks, such as someone who might not know the best practice around updating a certain object to prevent them from changing or impacting anything that might go awry. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see that we have the ability to control access to different object types within a model. So I might have my power users restricted to only being able to read a risk object instead of updating and editing that object. So another way that you can add an additional level of security. So from a conceptual level, that all might make sense, but it's probably best to show what I'm talking about here in the system. So let us pull up the OrbusInfinity dashboard. this is the main landing page within OrbusInfinity, that you have a good look at all of the different object types within your given system. It's important to note that you have different filters for your different models. Right now, I'm looking primarily at my baseline architecture model. So for my example organization here, my baseline architecture model is my production environment. It's the most up-to-date representation of my enterprise. So from this list, I can get a good sense of the different technologies, locations available, applications, but of course today I'm focused primarily on my risks. So I can get a really good look at all of the risks in my organization by selecting the risk icon here. So this pulls up all of the risks that are within my baseline architecture model. You'll notice I have different filters I could apply if I wanted to pull in the risk objects from other models as well. However, here I'm focused mostly on baseline architecture. You might notice that all of these, of course, say baseline architecture. Why do I even need this column? That's a great question. So you're able to update the columns that are available here within our column options button. So you'll see a list of all of the columns that are available for our risk view here. And I can, of course, remove any that I don't need. So for this example, I'm going to remove the description. Looks like that's blank, as well as the model, since I know all of those are the same. If you're looking very closely, you might also notice that all of the last modified bys and the date last modified are also very similar. So I'm going to remove those as well. However, speaking of those attributes or those data points here, for a given object, like our risk objects here, we're able to pull in that data into our view. So for risk, I'm going to pull in risk impact as well as risk likelihood. So once I save, this updates my list so I can see the different risks in my organization, as well as my risk impact and risk likelihood scores that might impact my different objects here. This is also very helpful, but what if I want to see this information a little bit clearer? I have all of these different numbers here, and it's hard for me to discern what is the most important, what has a high risk impact for my organization. So if I violate regulatory compliance, obviously it's going to be very bad. But I want to see that more readily within my view. I can add conditional formatting to this view within my column options as well. So I'll select my risk impact column, and then I'll add in a few rules here. So I'll pick 3 colors, do red, orange, and green. So what this is going to do is highlight the different cells within this list with the given colors if I give them a condition. So I want to give the values a value of, or a color of red if they're greater than, let's call it 3.9. So that's going to bring in our 4s and our 5 values here. And I'm going to say we're all good if it's less than 2.1. I'll give it this sort of in-between color if it is in between those 2 values. So once I save, it updates my view to pull in that conditional formatting. So now I can see right away, I have some high risk impact risks here that I can maybe do some more analysis on. So another way to bring out that information more readily, and we'll see another way to do that later on. I can always save this view that I've just created with all the settings that I've applied. I go into my Details tab, and then changing the name of the view. I can share this with other users in my organization, or I can keep this just to myself if this is something that maybe I'm a risk analyst and only I want to see this view. that's just one of the ways to bring out this sort of analysis in an ad hoc way. So going through the risk catalog, helping to bring out the important information. I could even add filters here if I only wanted to see different values. So if I only wanted to see the risks that have a high risk impact score, I could filter that as well. But next I'm going to show another way to sort of discern our risks and how our risks are related to another object, our controls. So how we're mitigating the different risks. I've created this view before, so I can go to my public views section where I have different views that have been created by individuals within my organization. At the top of my screen, you'll see I have 4 that have already been created for me. One of these being the risk control traceability view. When I select this list, you can see my familiar catalog of all of my risks, as well as the scores brought out here. But I want to see the controls for each of these risks. So what do we have to mitigate? So if I select intellectual property theft, you can see the controls that are going to be impacted. From here, I could select on each of these different objects if I wanted a more in-depth look at each of these controls. But another way to bring out that information for our users. Now, finally, I have a lot of stakeholders that care about the different risks in my organization. These users might not have access to OrbusInfinity. They might not have an account within this, but they have the ability to view this information through what are called SharePoint web parts, as Julia showed earlier. So I can go to my SharePoint page, the link in the top left. Which brings me to my SharePoint landing page. And then I've created a section for my risk and security analysis. So just a brief landing page where I've pulled in some of my most useful information to share with my stakeholders. So I can send them a link to this page so that they can see my entire risk catalog here. So I've embedded the view that we created earlier into our SharePoint. And if I select cyber attacks, for example, I get a list of all of the attributes associated with this object. And I can also see related objects. So I can see all of the controls that are related to our cyber attacks risk. At the bottom of my screen, I've also embedded what's called a visualization. So a way to create a sort of map of how our risk might impact other different objects. So we spoke a bit about our capabilities, but you can see we also have our technologies here displayed. So if I have a risk that occurs, I can see the different technologies that would be impacted by that risk. Just another way to share this content with stakeholders so that you can make more informed decisions going forward. So from a risk analysis section, that's a lot of good content that we have within OrbusInfinity to help speak to those different questions, speak to those different items that you want to represent, how different things are connected, and display the impact these different risks might have, and to help make more informed decisions on how to mitigate and move forward from those risks.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Joe, for that. And thanks, Julia, for your section as well. We've got, just before we wrap up, a couple of minutes left just for a very couple of quick questions. Anyone else that's watching, do please feel free to get your questions in now. Any that we can't quite get back to, because appreciate we're short on time, we'll make sure to reach out to you directly just to ask any. One question here, perhaps Joe or Julia, either one, you can maybe take this. There's one question on importing the risk catalog. How would I import my risk catalog from another source? But also, do you offer any integrations with the risk management systems available?
Yeah, I could take that one. That's a great question. So it really depends. there are different ways that we can go about this. So we have the Excel import tool that Yulia showed. That is actually how I brought in the risks for this demonstration. So pulling in the different objects and details or the attributes of those objects to have them created in the system. We also have an intake form, so you can send those to relevant stakeholders to fill out different risks, as well as those attributes for those risks, and have those be created, as well as we have different integrations that might be offered depending on the system that bring in those risks as well. Great question, though.
Perfect, thanks for that. And then, another question here, perhaps Yulia, more on your side about creating a data dictionary in OrbusInfinity. Don't know if there's anything you'd like to add there, maybe on anyone else that's done that in your experience. Any tips on how that could work?
Yeah, sure. We can even leverage, in fact, I've seen some nice examples of leveraging SharePoint lists where you can, besides just storing like something like links to other places, to while you're designing a SharePoint page, you can just bring links to anything and you can bring to some external source, but you can even leverage the native functionalities of the SharePoint list where you can add both object names to the key concepts that we spoke about previously. You may as well add some like descriptions in another column and then have the actual snapshot of a shape from Visio, since we have as well various templates for Visio allowing to then model your data models. And each of those templates, of course, come also with a consistent look and feel how the shapes look like, which you can then also, for an intuitive experience for the stakeholders that might consume those Visios from SharePoint, for example, because you may embed those. That is another like just also concept that we may as well add to like that dictionary or that list view with the various definitions. Overall, a very good point, because it's very, of course, recommended to create such data dictionaries and to place them at the place that is consumed by your various teams and stakeholders. So SharePoint is definitely could be one.